From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner, and I'm without Jason this week. My co-host is in Perth, and today our guest is just not in a time zone that we can coordinate. But I am going to bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. So I'm super excited to have a fellow Victoria, British Columbia native, Meg, joining me. Meg, remind me how to pronounce your last name properly.
Kapil.
Kapil. I thought so, but I always like to check psychological safety, having those names correct. So Meg Kapil and I have had children at two schools together. And that's where we first met. But Meg is a counselor and a PhD candidate. She has done some award-winning work on curriculums for high schoolers, and I'm going to let her tell you all about it. So first off, welcome, Meg. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thanks so much for having me here. This is a great opportunity to chat with you. So I've been a counselor for over 15 years. I work with children, youth, adults, families. I've had a lot of focus, as you mentioned, on anxiety. I do a lot of work with supporting folks who've experienced trauma as well. So a variety of different training and certifications in trauma modalities. So helping people to heal from really difficult experiences, both in terms of what's happened to them and what they didn't get or unmet needs. And I've worked in a few different positions in post-secondary over the years. So I've been an instructor, was a practicum coordinator for a while. It was a super fun job, clinical supervisor for graduate students, and a counselor as well. I don't work in a school currently, so I think a lot of your guests work in schools. So I might have a little bit of a different perspective, but I do collaborate with a lot of students and teachers and school counselors and other support staff at a variety of different schools. So I actually, I guess you could say I work with a lot of folks where the existing programs aren't working very well. So I have that perspective.
Meg, that's a fabulous place to begin. And I often tell a story, and I know you've listened to a couple of episodes, so you may have heard me tell this public health parable. And it's about two adults sitting at the side of a river, and they see a young student being swept along in the current. So of course, as adults do, they jump right in and save that child. And just as they're pulling that child out, they see another one and then another one. And so these two adults are just at their wits' end trying to get all these kids out. And eventually somebody thinks to go up to the river and figure out why these kids are falling in. And so I want to start by asking you, given that you're not right in schools, but I think the hard problem you're trying to solve involves students who spend most of their time in schools and their extended families. Where do you see your role in that parable? What part do you play?
Yeah, I guess probably starting as the person on the bank fishing the kids out, because definitely most of my experiences with students, elementary, middle, high school, university students who are definitely floundering, if not, falling under the water. So that's my lens, is really at the beginning are the ones who are not doing well and not maybe supported by kind of the current system. So I could say that I trudged upstream and tried to figure out what I can do more broadly, because I'm only one person. And I needed to be able to create a program that really was attending to these, what I could see were unmet needs in schools. And so that's what I've tried to do with my PhD research.
Awesome. And so I'm going to invite you to spend a few minutes and maybe walk us through following that path of curiosity, where you started and where you are now. Could you do that in a few minutes for us?
Definitely. Yeah. And, I always say you really need a very strong why if you're going to do, any kind of academic research. PhD programs, they're very hard. They don't just give them to you. So you really need to know why you're there. So I actually have a distinct recollection of, probably a year before, I started on my research path, just sitting in my office, and I had seen, a number of kids of different ages come in with very similar presenting challenges, and just recognizing that we're not maybe tackling this challenge in the most kind of effective way, right? And so I would do a lot of work, as you know, around the stress and the anxiety regulation. And for a lot of those students, some of the school challenges would get better if it was something like test anxiety or performance anxiety, like presentations. But there was this whole other group when we kind of settled down that layer of stress and anxiety. There was this whole other layer of challenges that were really the stressors. And so what I wanted to do was be able to work with the stress and the stressors at the same time, because I could see we were sending students over here for mental health support and then over here for sort of executive function or learning support, but neither one was working very well because we weren't doing it together within the same person. And so that's what I went back to school to try to be able to do for the people in my office, but also hopefully more broadly.
I love that. And I know you've come up with some really unique and interesting, do you call them tools? I know you have workbooks. I know you have a stress stories project. So maybe, why don't we start with the stress stories project? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is really the practical application of all of my research so far. So I've really worked at kind of developing an integrated theoretical approach to student success. So the kind of program I'm in is in educational psychology. So I study with Alison Hadwin, who's, decades of experience in self-regulated learning. And so that's kind of my area of research. So I'm integrating all of that work from the process essentially of being able to manage all the different components of learning. And so I've kind of incorporated elements from stress optimization, which is a piece that's sometimes missing in these kind of broader like educational approaches. And part of the piece that component adds is a really sort of rich understanding of like the biological underpinnings. So a constructed theory of emotion, for example, right? So recognizing that there's all these unconscious and implicit elements that are perhaps impacting engagement and stress. So all the things that I would see in those folks in my office who are not being well served by the kind of current programs. And then from that, there's, a variety of research projects and kind of, proving the theory essentially. And then the Stress Stories Project is really the practical application of that. So, there's some kind of interventions we've used with our university students. And then also this is a program that really pulls together kind of teaching students about stress itself. So kind of broad beliefs, like working with stress mindset, for example, and the kind of role that memory plays as well, or prior experience in how you're constructing emotion. And so that's, I think, a really kind of important contribution, because a lot of programs miss folks in when they're sort of a one size fits all. So this really speaks to how there's so many individual experiences. And it's not just what happened, but how you make meaning of it. And so they learn about the kind of ingredients in emotion, and then they get some sort of practices around this is how you kind of regulate the stress or emotion in general. There's a support or relational component, and then there's some essentially self-regulated learning practices. So how are we actually going to do the tests better, do the presentations better, or how are we actually going to deal with the school stressors better? So that all gets put together. And and there's in the sort of research part of it, there's a reflection component, so that, what did you learn? What will you do? That metacognitive kind of piece. And there's also a memory reconsolidation component. And so that's where they take their actual experiences of stress at school, unpack it, imagine what it'd be like to be able to do that differently with all the things they're learning, and then get to practice that. And we have found that there's a bigger effect for that group over the reflection alone.
So I have two questions. I have a billion questions, but I have two that I'm going to ask you. So first of all, for our audience, they've heard of mindsets. They were the cool new fad, right? Probably about 7 or 8 years ago, for every teacher needed to learn about mindset. And so they've heard about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, but I bet stress mindset might be a new term for our audience. So could you just summarize what you're talking about when you say stress mindset?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's really your general belief about stress itself. And so, you can look to Stanford University, Aaliyah Crum and folks. These are, if you want to learn more about this, you can actually go and see the videos they use in their experiments. And so they're easily accessible. And so you end up with either a stress is debilitating, where you perceive that stress is really, really bad for you, essentially. And bad things will happen if you're stressed. And then a stress is enhancing mindset. So that's where you perceive stress, might be challenging, but it's also going to be a really important component of growth. And so just essentially that's kind of your relationship with stress itself.
Excellent. That's great clarity. Thank you. And so then the second question I have, because here at Flourishing at School, we're all about measuring what matters. And so you talked a little bit about a self-report. Is there is that the way that you're measuring the outcomes, or are there other things that you're doing, other things you're looking at, whether it's biomarkers or an actual scale? How are you measuring?
Yeah. So we have a survey, what we're using to measure. And so there is a pretty well-established stress mindset scale. And I'm also using some other kind of measurements. Coping self-efficacy is another one.
Yep.
So that's really your perspective on how capable you are of essentially handling the stress and the stressor. There's an emotion-focused, problem-focused, and support component. And so actually the program is really built around that construct. And so there's established scales, but they are all self-report. So I'm not using biomarkers or anything like that at this point, but that would be a really interesting addition, to check cortisol levels and things like that. But I don't currently have that capacity. But.
Well, and we have to realize that this is happening inside schools, right? So how long do you get, or does a teacher get, for each of these kind of segments? Because we know that part of the challenge with being in a system that is like school is finding time. If you take time from somewhere, you lose it somewhere else. So where are you seeing this happen?
Yeah, great question. And that's something I was, and again, I kind of developed this during COVID. So really conscious of not being able to go into the school myself. So wanting to be hopefully not very burdensome on teachers. So they're kind of like 10 to 15 minute videos that are the learning modules, and the classroom teachers are delivering those within the sort of social emotional learning curriculum. And so it aligns pretty well with like some of the health pieces. And so they're including it, and depending on what they're also doing, like some schools have some other kind of social emotional curriculum that they're using as well. So it kind of fits in quite nicely with some of those pieces as well. And they can kind of structure it wherever they want. And they just kind of follow the video, and there's some activities that they can kind of guide the class through as well.
That's brilliant. All right. Anything else you want to tell us about stress stories before I switch to your workbooks?
No, I think that's good for now. If you have any other thoughts later, but that's kind of the gist of it.
No, I think that gives a really clear idea of how that's working. And I guess one question that someone in our audience might have is, hey, if I want to use this tool, is it available yet? Or are you still testing it before you make it widely available?
Yeah, I'll still test it at a few other sites probably before making it widely available. But maybe if someone's interested in kind of participating in some of the initial research, they can contact me if they like. And I can, because we have it's at elementary school currently, and then we have a middle school partner starting after spring break, so in April. But we'd love to test it in a high school location as well.
Excellent. I can certainly give a shout out to all of our listeners, and they can reach out to me if they're interested in giving it a go. We've got lots of great champions in our audience.
Fantastic.
All right. So, you're welcome. The other, I guess, more familiar tool that I've seen of yours is your Creating Calm workbooks. So would you share a little bit about those with our audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so this, I think probably reading through, you realize it's an integration of, across a number of different sources. And so these are just kind of workbooks. There's a kind of junior, youth, and adult one. I have a kind of one that I've developed for teachers and parents that I haven't finished yet, really kind of a co-regulation workbook. So hopefully I'll finish that one soon. And so there's also kind of summative stories, like a nice kind of protocol that helps sum up the strategies that, I will co-create with the kids, and they love to sort of act it out and read it out. And it's a great way for them to keep kind of what they've learned, kind of active within their families. So everyone's kind of got the same language. And so it really, it kind of works through kind of developing awareness of what's going on in your thoughts, in your body when you're feeling dysregulated, particularly with stress and anxiety, then learning to kind of label that, and then the sort of some strategies around kind of action, which are sort of thinking strategies and kind of body regulation strategies. And it also has that sort of memory reconsolidation component in it too. So there's, a lot of people struggle because they learn all this great stuff and then they can't do it when they're stressed, right? So when we're highly activated, we go back to sort of a rigid pattern response, which really is whatever we did before, right? And so people get really frustrated. And so really important part of kind of narrowing that gap is when you're calm later, and for kids doing this with a trusted parent, being able to kind of rewind what happened and imagine and visualize a different outcome. And that is most effective for sort of narrowing the gap. And you sort of really can experience what it'd be like if you could do that. And doing that both kind of retrospectively as well as proactively. So if you say have a presentation, well, let's practice for the presentation, but we also need to practice for the stress part. And so they're sort of separate but connected, and you have to practice both. And so you can I've got some forms where you can kind of work on that. Yeah. And that's one of
sorry.
So
go right ahead.
I'm just saying one other component that is in there that I think is kind of unique. And again, it comes from, all those students who come into my office who have been taught breathing and mindfulness at school, and they come in there and I mention these things and they're like, oh, I hate those things. And so, part of what in the kind of the body regulation component is really teaching a match between the strategy and level of activation, which often gets missed when folks are being taught, do this breathing practice, but not without the context. And so, teaching which strategies work for kind of lower to middle levels of activation and those that work for kind of higher levels of activation, and just a recognition that everyone's a bit different, right?
I love that. And I love that you're really teaching kids how to read their own internal thermometer, and know that what works for them might be different, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something it's again, I always think, okay, is this simple for a teacher to use? It is so simple, and it will make everything better if you can help your students to, and this is something I've done with my own kids. When they overcome something, I will remind them, okay, do you see the strengths you just used? Do you see the strategies that worked? Remember this, because this situation is going to happen again, probably. And so keep this solution in your pocket. And you're right that when someone is under extreme or a high level, their ability, I always say it's like you're throwing a life preserver to somebody who is sitting there with their eyes shut and not looking, that they're not going to square breathe when they're too far gone, right? So you're really attending to their very specific needs, and you're not the first person. I think we've had probably all but one of our guests talk about the really bad one size fits all solution. And it's so hard, right? Because school is a place where the one size fits all would be easy.
Absolutely. I understand the desire for that, right?
Wouldn't it be great?
Totally. And I think something, again, that, and I know so many wonderful teachers and school counselors, and, it really, they're all working their hardest. But I think the sort of misunderstanding is, folks, especially with elementary school age children, there's this idea that, you're going to tell them something, or there's a poster on the wall and they're going to then do it. And that's not very developmentally informed. And really, we all learn to sort of quote, even the language self-regulation is problematic because we don't really learn that until we're even we can sometimes self-regulate, but not all the time, and that we learn through repeated experiences of being co-regulated. So we need more bodies is kind of what we need, right?
We do. And so I'd love to go back. I had written down co-regulation because I wanted to make sure we went back to that, because it is a huge theme in a lot of the teaching that I do. I work predominantly with whole school, and we know teacher burnout levels are higher than they've ever been. They were always bad, and they're worse. And I'm curious, and again, I'm not asking you to quote me science, but just from a gut level, how much do you think the teacher burnout and stress levels are problematic? Because how do you co-regulate when you're not personally regulated?
Absolutely, yeah. And just to be clear, we're not blaming teachers for this.
Absolutely not. I always say, I say this to empower teachers because it gives you permission to take care of yourself and
100%.
And understand that that's taking care of your class. So I'm glad you added that.
Teachers are amazing. And because schools are this wonderful forum for us, fixing their mental health and all of these kind of things we're becoming aware of, they keep getting asked to do more and more without appropriate supports, right? And so now all of a sudden there's supposed to be trauma therapists and counselors and coaches and,
diversity inclusion and
diversity inclusion experts. And it's just not possible, especially we know that how people learn, like we've been talking about stress and anxiety regulation, that's only achieved through co-regulation. And so absolutely, if teachers are, and again, adult regulation first is kind of a key component of co-regulation. And so it's just fact, it's just science. You just don't create the challenge in the child, but you have a choice of whether you make it better or worse. And if you don't have enough supports and resources yourself, that's going to have a big impact on the kiddos you're supporting. No amount of posters and programming is going to overcome that. And again, a lot of times work is, with I think perhaps a downside of some inclusive learning initiatives is now teachers have a classroom of very complex needs, yet without additional supports. And so they just really can't co-regulate the number of students they're being asked to co-regulate without additional regulated adults to kind of help do that work. So it's just not possible.
Yeah. And again, I don't like to leave teachers on a note of, sorry, not possible. But where I see they do have power, so they can't change policy, they can't hire somebody new, but it's about that culture and understanding that they're all in this together and that everybody has a moment where they're tired and needs somebody else to lift them up. And when you've got a little extra, who else on your team needs a lift?
Absolutely.
And so I think that the message is around, you don't control the policy or the hiring, but you do play a role in the culture, and the culture can be changed from inside.
Yeah. And even connecting to some of the pieces we've been talking about, your sort of relationship essentially with stress itself. So even if you can't, fix all those things we're talking about, your perception of stress being good or bad has a ripple effect essentially on the kids that you're working with. Your perception of being capable of managing various, kind of pieces of the classroom culture is going to have an impact. And, looking for those kind of small wins or those moments of success or those moments of increased regulation in the kids in the class and celebrating those. So even just that perspective will really help to kind of find the successes that are there.
Awesome. Well, that segues really great into the next question I have. I love to ask our guests, what's something that you've tried or seen tried in a school that worked really well?
Yeah, my answer probably won't surprise you. I think generally it's about the people. And so there's lots of, kind of programs and initiatives that work well, but anything that promotes people to feel capable and control themselves in their environment and kind of connected to community, that's when the programs and curriculum work well. And if you sort of trace that back, there's always some really fantastic teacher or counselor or administrator that's kind of, championing that success. And often with those qualities of being caring and curious and facilitating those attuned relationships with the students. That's, I think, more than the content, that's really what works well.
That's a great answer, and it's very empowering for our teachers because, again, we're not saying here's a tool, now use this. We're saying you are the tool and you have it's like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. You had the power all along. It's just understanding when and where to use it and how to put those guardrails and boundaries in place when you don't have the bandwidth to use it.
Absolutely. And teachers through positive experiences they facilitate with students can make such a big impact, and it's really incredible when that goes well.
You are so right. I was at IPENT, which is the International Positive Educators Network. And so a group of educators who would be the champions in their schools from around the world. And it was very interesting because the keynote speaker asked us, think back to that one teacher who really made a massive impact on your life. And I would say that probably 99% of the people in the room became teachers because of that person. And I happened to be at a table and we weren't all teachers. There was a lot of researchers and practitioners there. And at our table, most of us didn't have someone and we had ended up in this field because we wished we had.
Interesting.
And so it's very interesting to see that power of one person who sees and values you for who you are, believes in you and challenges you to do and be your best.
Absolutely.
Teachers know this, right? Preaching to the choir.
100%, 100%. Yeah. And so interesting that at your table, you all became who you didn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that wow, I wish I had. And I was actually at an event so Meg and I have had kids at one school in common. And I was at an event at that school the other day and we were looking at one of the other parents with me who had a similar education background to mine. And we said, I think the real difference between this school and our experience of education is that belief that someone has your back. And we knew that at our school, every kid had someone on that campus who had their back. And this dad and I were both saying, man, our experiences of education would have been so different if we had believed that. So I think schools have made a pretty great pivot in that direction.
Absolutely. And it kind of comes down to kind of, attachment science in a way, right? I mean, the basics of secure relationships are feeling seen, right? So knowing that someone sees you and accepts you as you are, soothed, so that when you're having trouble, they'll be there to kind of help you out, whether that's emotional or practical, and safe, right? And so with those in place, there's the opportunity, of course, to flourish.
I love that. So we talked about the thing that went right that you've seen. I want to flip that question because I love learning lessons from things that have gone wrong. So is there an example that you can think of something that you've tried or seen tried that just really fell flat?
Definitely. Probably kind of the opposite of the previous answer. And so, as I mentioned before, as a counselor, I often get the students where it hasn't gone well. So I probably have a little more examples of that than many other people, because for obvious reasons, I don't tend to see the students where it's going really well. They don't come to my office. So there are those students out there, but I tend to have a much bigger sample of the ones where it's not going well. And so I would say in general that it's really more the how than the what. So kind of like we were talking about, I've seen some really good programs and initiatives fail really badly, like mindfulness programs, zones of regulation, some excellent programs. But when they're delivered with this sort of hammer approach, without the developmental stage of the child in mind, so no kind of attending to co-regulation, no room for diversity, and I'm going to include neurodiversity in that, or any other kind of individual differences, it doesn't tend to go well. And there's sometimes this dynamic where the program gets weaponized, and that's my word, I guess. So what I mean by that is, let's say, you teach we're talking about breathing strategies. So let's say you have a child who's really dysregulated and, they don't do their breathing strategies that they've been taught. And then they get punished for that. So they get sent out in the hall, for example, until they can use their strategies. And so by the time they come to my office and I, mention breathing, they have a huge reaction because they're very defended against that. And it's because nobody was really attending to what they needed, that co-regulation. And they tend to be predominantly kids that are neurodivergent and kids who have trauma histories. And so there's good reasons that they are dysregulated and can't enact that strategy in the moment. And so I would say it's not the what, it's not the program curriculum, it's sort of how it's delivered. And that is unfortunately in the kind of folks that I work with happens a lot, which is not very good.
Well, and I think it just speaks to the fact that many teachers weren't trained for this. I love that our education is changing, but it hasn't caught up. And so it really, I think, pulls on a classroom teacher, because not only do I need to know the new curriculum and the new core competencies, but now I need to know the latest neuroscience and the breathing techniques. And I need to understand the nuances of this child with that label, because we know that labels don't mean that the same thing is happening for each child. And so it's a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every child has different, I have the luxury of that in my counseling office, and we develop a different toolkit for every single child. And it's not fair, again, to ask teachers to do that without additional support and training. And I know in our area, there's not that much funding for school counselors, and they're given a caseload of hundreds. And it's, again, a task that's not really very reasonable. They do an amazing, epic job of this, but it's sort of, kind of a big ask. So, again, back to, I don't work in policy, but I'm just saying if someone can influence funding more trained
if someone can get a bridge up the river so that you can stop pulling the kids out.
Yeah, exactly. More people who are trained and can be those co-regulating influences in the classroom, and not expecting the teachers to be able to do that all by themselves.
Yeah, that's, you're bringing me back to thinking about, I used to have a dance class for children with diagnoses, and a lot of them had brain injuries. We had kids on the autism spectrum, Down syndrome children. So kids that wanted a peer group, but couldn't progress year after year with the other students based on either their physical or mental challenges. And we found that placing kids in a circle in a specific way that some of the children with Down syndrome would do really well with the kids with autism. The Down syndrome kids could hold their hands and keep them in line in a way that meant the adults in the room were better able to help everybody regulate, but we didn't have to be keeping everybody in line. So I think it's those strategies that nobody teaches you in teachers college, that eventually you figure out on your own that maybe a student like this might do well with a peer like this. But there's also the other side of let's not burden the kids to take care. It's a conundrum figuring it all out, right?
It's complicated. And I think as teachers will probably tell you, every cohort they get, especially in those younger years, has a different feel to it and needs something different, right? And so it is that kind of, applying those big ideas, like, we were talking about mindsets, for example, but looking at how those are different with the individual kind of characters you have in your room. And it's complicated.
Yeah, you're right. So something that you touched on was an outcome of flourishing. And so we're called the Flourishing at School podcast. And I wonder from your perspective, which is a little unique compared to our typical guests, how you would see flourishing if you walked into a classroom that you were working with. How would you know it was a flourishing classroom?
Yeah, great question. And I think, you talk about both, like there's two different dimensions to well-being and mental health. And so there's sort of the feeling good part, which we sometimes call hedonic in the research. And so those are things like good feelings, general life satisfaction, and often kind of an absence of things like stress. So I think if you walked down into that classroom, you'd see, happiness, joy, laughter, probably, sort of a lot of energy and engagement, and creative and flexible thinking and problem solving, alongside pro-social behavior, like helping others, within the school and other communities. And then I think the functioning well part is interesting. So this is often, like in the research, what we call eudaimonic. And so this is really kind of that idea of living up to your best self. And in this area of flourishing, we actually expect some negative emotions. In fact, things like stress are necessary to achieve the goals you have that are part of your sense of purpose and your sense of kind of being your best self. So in this part of kind of a flourishing school, you would see people who are really hopefully living in alignment with their purpose. So it would be context specific, in their values, and being open to engage in stress and challenge, perhaps even in the short term, in order to get to where they want to go, over time. So doing hard things because it matters. And so, supporting that kind of, people to be capable and control, connected, but you would see kind of a whole range of emotions here and perhaps a bit of a mess sometimes. And that's okay, because it's like sorting out where you need to go kind of over the longer term. Yeah.
I had a vision come to mind of the movie, and I'm going to forget it, the Disney movie that Dr. Keltner did that was so great about the emotions.
Oh, Inside Out?
Inside Out, yes. And so as you were saying that, I'm like, okay, a flourishing classroom kind of looks like the head inside of Inside Out.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's a misperception around stress that we often hear. And I think, unfortunately, kids get that, from all the messages they receive on social media, is that, stress is bad. But you won't actually have a truly flourishing environment if you don't also incorporate stress, because stress is going to be there whenever you're going for goals. And arguably, we all work towards goals all the time, even if it's just putting your shoes on that day, or, something like, hosting a podcast, they're always there.
Yeah, I love that. And I love Kelly McGonigal's work on stress and stress priming you. And I know a reframe I often encourage students and adults to use when they're having that feeling is, I'm excited. That, okay, if you can use that feeling as, okay, I'm primed. This is, if I didn't feel this before I went on stage, then maybe I'm not trying something hard enough. And so, and again, that's not going to work with an adult or a student who is at their highest level. But as you start to feel those feelings, those sensations, it's that naming, right?
Absolutely.
And we know how I have seen, and I'm curious if you've seen really this contagion effect about especially teenage girls not naming that they're experiencing an anxious sensation, but they're naming themselves that I am anxious. And really that has become cool because mental health is very public, which is a wonderful thing, except we need to really parse out the difference between that helpful stress that primes you to do something versus the unhelpful stress that keeps you from doing something.
Absolutely. The sort of threat versus challenge response, right? And I spend a lot of time correcting misperceptions about stress in the kind of individual work. And this is a component of that stress stories program. Because I definitely see, because of the wonderful shift towards including these conversations about mental health. I mean, in our day, we suppressed everything, and that arguably didn't work great. We're over here now and we're talking about mental health. But I think the sort of maybe unintended dark side of that is there's a little bit of an over pathologization of things that are actually just normal part of life and necessary, like stress, for example, is, and again, like not only is stress not bad, we actually can't flourish without it. And I think that message is not in the kind of current social media messaging around it. So yeah, you do get this effect where, and then again, you can get communities of connection, which seem really good in the beginning, but unfortunately the entry and sometimes the membership into those communities is having anxiety. So it's an identity of a mental illness, which is of course distinct from mental health and well-being. So you can't actually get better without losing your community. And so that's a new problem too. So, we have created new problems as well as solved some of the old ones. So yeah.
You're reminding me back of, so when I was in elementary school way back in the day, no attention to mental health, but definitely to speech. And so at that time, a really big problem was correcting lisping S's.
Oh.
And all of my friends had lisping S's. And I wanted to go to the class that they got to go to. And they were often rewarded with chocolate. And so I pretended to lisp on purpose to go to that class and spend time with my friends. And I ended up actually developing a lisp that took me years to get rid of because nobody believed I had a lisp because I hadn't started with one. But I learned one because I wanted to be in that crowd. So I think that reminds me a little bit of what you're talking about, and that, this group, if when you're okay, you don't get to be a part of it anymore, then nobody wants to be okay.
Exactly. And it's not really celebrated in the same way, right? So it's interesting. And I think it's really important to distinguish between, again, the sort of normal expected part of the stress that we all need and we need to be able to kind of do well versus like what might be an overwhelm or a burnout from, especially again, more predominantly in folks who have a trauma history or kind of neurodivergent. And so, recognizing, there can be good kinds and bad kinds, and helping to kind of tease those apart is really important.
Yeah, that's a great message for our listeners. Thank you for that. So we're a podcast and we love sharing information over podcasts, and we love to ask our guests how they like to get new information around their field. And so are you a book reader or a podcast listener? What are your go-to resources, Meg?
Honestly, a bit of everything. I am a compulsive book purchaser. I have a lot of, if you saw my office, there's a lot of books and stacks of books everywhere, which are great. And I love to read those. I think there's something about having something in my hand that I probably prefer. But I also, love a good podcast as well, and especially if it is in an area that maybe I'm not that familiar with. So, I like to listen to stuff when I'm out walking or running, just if it might change my perspective on something or expose me to something I haven't heard about. So I kind of seek out things that are maybe a little bit different or outside of my research area, just to keep learning.
Well, I'm going to share two of my favorites with our audience, and maybe it'll prime something for you. So I just finished this one, Jill Bolte Taylor's Whole Brain Living, which I love. Yep. And then Shankar Vedantam, Useful Delusions. I love his podcast.
That's actually my favorite podcast, The Hidden Brain. I love it.
Hidden Brain.
Yep. I don't miss an episode. It's awesome.
It is so well done. I aspire to be Shankar. We'll have to have him on someday.
He's just such a good storyteller. It's wonderful. And really, the way he weaves research together with personal stories is fantastic. Yeah.
And in a very comfortable language.
Yeah.
I find that his language is inclusive because he talks about some pretty deep science concepts. any other favorites that you've got? So you listen all the time to Hidden Brain.
Yeah, Hidden Brain, I love. The Psychology podcast is another good one. I listen to, I can only have so much time, so I actually often prioritize like some kind of more clinical ones. So related to EMDR, for example, there's a couple of really good ones. And, notice that. And there's one called The Evidence-Based Therapist, which I really love, because they take articles. And so you can go get the research article and they walk through the research articles. So some really seminal works. And so I really love that one. It's like you feel like you're reading, kind of really heavy research articles in a community. So those are a couple ones that I listen to, and they're very helpful for sort of my work. And anything.
Those are great.
Anything I love Daniel Siegel, so anything Daniel Siegel, I have the whole collection. I'm a huge fan. So I would say that there's a lot of those books on my shelf.
Awesome. You've given us, those are actually novel resources, because we have 99% of our guests say Brené Brown and Adam Grant, which
really?
We love them both.
Yeah.
We did a podcast bingo episode where I actually went back and looked for repeating themes, and we made a bingo card of the things that most of our guests said, and Adam Grant and Brené were on there. The one size fits all solution was on there. So these are like themes that everybody talks about, which is great to gather and know. But I do love that you've shared some novel resources with our audience. So thanks for that.
If anyone has time to read Daniel Siegel's, his book, The Mind, he's got lots of really great books, but that one in particular is fantastic, just in kind of looking at what assumptions you have. We're all talking about flourishing and mental health, and rarely is the mind kind of defined. So that's a really great one to sort of check how you're thinking about the mind.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you for that. I've read it before, and I'm going to go back and reread it. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before I close us off for today?
No, this has been great. I'm just curious, because you talk to so many interesting people working in schools, what kind of main themes have popped up in the conversations you've been hosting over the last little while?
That's a great question. And I think teacher burnout has been pervasive. We had Dr. Helen Kelly on, I think 2 episodes ago, and she had a new book that I actually think came out about 3 or 4 days ago that I have yet to read, but I'm looking forward to it. And so teacher burnout has been a large topic. Again, that the challenge of the school handing a one size fits all solution, and the teacher not having the time or the skill to know how to make this fit everybody in the class. That would be another theme. And I think the one that Jason always brings in, because I talk a lot about feeling good and functioning well, and Jason always likes to add, and contributing to your community in a meaningful way, as that third prong. And so that has been a theme that we talk with a lot of the guests around, that it's not just individual, that at the end of the day, if you fix you, that's just you. And this is about us as a community, which is why we talk about whole school well-being.
Right.
And so those are the themes. I don't think any of them are groundbreaking or surprising. For me, the challenge that I see right now is that we are putting more and more attention on having mentally healthy schools, both the staff, the students, and the leadership, and the greater community. And it's not getting better. And that's, for me, the why I keep doing this, because I believe eventually we'll be able to add what we know on an individual to some type of machine algorithm that will help contextualize it and make it easier. Because I don't think we're getting it right yet, but I think we've got the right people. We know there's no lack of people with great hearts who are trying. And so that's really, for me, why I keep reaching out and asking more questions, in hope that eventually we'll figure it out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great sentiment. And that's, again, why I'm here doing a PhD program, which arguably I don't need. So.
Well, thank you for keeping on for students and their communities. We really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing your work. Meg, if our audience is interested in staying in touch or learning more about your work, Jason and I are found on LinkedIn. Where would be the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can send me a message through my website as well, megkapil.com. That's probably the easiest place.
Wonderful. Well, that's the end of this episode of the Flourishing at School podcast. If you're listening to us, don't forget you can also watch us over on our Flourish DX YouTube channel. And we'll be sharing clips on YouTube of some of our best moments of this episode. And we hope you'll connect with Jason and I there. That's it for today. We'll catch you next time. And until we do, make sure you're flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.